Out on this warm and balmy afternoon. I had planned to look somber since I assumed that the election in Alabama would go the other way. So I am very happy that it didn't, and that a majority of the voters, at least in Alabama, were able to turn their back on somebody who wanted to go backwards in history by 100 or 50, 200 years and represents pretty much everything that is going wrong in the society. So it was a way of voting against him, against Mr. Bannon, against Mr. Trump, against the thrust of the Republican Party. And so it was a remarkable, I found it that way. I'm hoping most of you did too. I had expected to wake up and have a long face, and I didn't, so I was pleased about that. Okay, let me get through the few announcements we almost always make. These evenings are produced by three organizations. The Left Forum, that produces those conferences in the spring of every year, and will be hosting the next Left Forum, June 1 to June 3rd of 2018. And I'm pleased to let you know, before the public knows, that one of the keynote speakers will be Jane O'Meara Sanders, who is the wife of Bernie Sanders, for those of you who don't know. And one of his closest advisors, the head of the Sanders Foundation, and the person who will be advising him when he runs for president again in 2020. I just found that out too, so here's some hot news for you. Okay. The other two organizations that help co-produce this event are the Judson Memorial Church, where you are currently sitting, which has very kindly made this space available to us. And then, in the words of the minister here, she believes that this event every month is part of the mission of her church, which is an interesting and very welcome attitude for a church to have. And so her name is Donna Schapper. If you ever have an occasion to speak with her and you have something to say about these evenings, I'm sure she'd be interested to hear it. And the last organization is Democracy at Work, which literally produces these programs and which also produces the radio and TV program now, Economic Update, that I know some of you listen to, as well as doing a whole lot of other things. So those three organizations collaborate to produce these monthly events. They are videotaped by Brian in the back of the room, and he usually gets them up within 24 to 48 hours on YouTube, where they are viewed by depending on the month, between 50 and 100,000 people around the world. It's an extraordinary exposure for what we do here. I do want to remind all of those that will see it, who are many more than those of you that are in the room, that those who are in the room have been asked to contribute $10 for the evening. You who will get to see this without being required are hereby put on your honor. If you go to our websites, it's very easy for you to donate the $10 that you would otherwise have paid, and therefore help defray the costs of, among other things, the production of the video, which is how you see what we do here. Last couple of announcements. I wanted to recognize the sponsor. Each of these evenings now has a sponsor. This particular sponsor, some of you have been here before, you know I do this at the beginning, has asked to remain anonymous, so we will, of course, honor that wish. This sponsor is a longtime supporter of what we do and a volunteer who works very closely with our team here in New York. We understand how much he values us by what he does, and we want him to know publicly how much we value what he has done and continues to do for that. If any of you watching or any of you here would like to be a sponsor, which is a fancy name for someone who contributes money, please know that we are interested and needy for that, and you can find out all the details about what that is and how you go about it by going to our major website, democracyatwork.info/sponsor. It's really simple, and everything there explains how this is done. So if you're really eager to be a sponsor, which I hope you are, that's the way to go to do it. If you are a fan or interested in our weekly radio and TV program, Economic Update, I should mention, for those of you that are not familiar, that it is produced at the YouTube studios on 15th Street and 9th Avenue. Some of you know that place as the Chelsea Market. It's a kind of a tourist place. How many of you know what the Chelsea Market is? Okay. Well, the YouTube owns that building. Google owns YouTube, you get the picture. And on the 6th floor of that building, YouTube has studios, and that's where we actually do this. If you're a fan, you can join about 1,000. We're just shy of 1,000 fans that sponsor the show. And the way you do that is you go to a website called patreon.com, Patreon, patreon.com/economic update. And there, for as little as $3 a month, you can become a person who is immediately given access not only to the television version of the program, but to other materials that we upload there for supporters. It is a way to support the ongoing work of that radio and TV station, and it is something we would ask you to consider doing. As it stands now, the radio program, the one that some of you hear here on WBAI, is now broadcast every week on about 95 stations around the United States. And by means of a network called the Free Speech TV Network, it is now beamed into about 45 million American homes. Given that we started here in 6.5 years ago, that's an amazing thing to say. And I really have to wonder out loud, despite the immodesty of it, whether ever before in American history a perspective as critical as ours on what's going on in the economy has gotten out to so many people for now so long a time. If you are interested, the podcast of the radio program is also available. It's available at no cost on our website. It's also available through iTunes, iHeartRadio, and very shortly, Google Play and Spotify. If you're my age, those words may not mean much to you, but if you're younger, they do. And we are also interested in finding public radio stations of all kinds, public access stations around the country who might be interested in carrying the program. Please get in touch with us at our two websites, rdwolff with 2fs.com and the big one, democracyatwork.info. If you have connections to a radio station in your area, we will take it from there in terms of getting them to carry the program as well. All right, so let's turn then to the economic updates. I am going to concentrate on what we said we would talk about tonight, the tax reform bill that is now just shy of being passed by the Congress. That should happen in the next week, if not sooner, maybe even tomorrow. It was going to be before the end of the year because it's in the nature of a Christmas present. I'll be telling you shortly who gets the present. I'll also be telling you who pays for the present. You are not in the first group. And now the present may have to be given sooner because they have one less vote. That election is a loss for the votes for that bill. Just one vote, but it's a close business, and one vote could make a lot of difference, which is probably why they switched from opposing Mr. Moore at the beginning to supporting him towards the end. And then the other topics. So let me do just a few little ones at the beginning, because I believe these are small items, but they tell you much about what's going on. The first one has to do with public education. And recently, as happens from time to time, Americans interested in public education, perhaps these days frightened by the decline of public education in all different ways, ask questions, which is very good that they do, about how education is working out in other countries. And so I thought I would say a few words about the country that usually scores number one in the world in terms of the quality and the quantity of the public education it provides its young people, because you might be interested in how it achieves that. What's the institutional way that it should be so remarkably and consistently at the top of every measure we have of the outcomes of a public education. The country is Finland. It's a Scandinavian country. It's up at the top all the time. No, still with the latest. I'm working off 2015 and 16, at least the data that I have. And so I thought, what might be interesting? And whether or not it's at the top, these are interesting things about how it organizes its system. It has a philosophical approach, which it puts into documents. And one of the interesting components, I thought, is that they stress that it's more important to teach children how to cooperate than it is to teach them how to compete. That's an explicit theoretical and philosophical commitment. Life is about cooperation first and competition way down the line below that. I found that extraordinary. I found that the amount of money paid to Finnish teachers and the general respect that they have in the population way exceeds what we have here in terms of who you are in the community if you're a teacher, what that represents and what it means. And then there were a couple of other things that just jumped out at me. I'm no expert on these things, but it jumped out at me. The tuition at all public schools in Finland is zero. Let me do that again. All levels, higher education, high school, no tuition, zero. They're not the only country in Europe that does that, but they do that. And finally, they have a rule. The French have this too. No private schools. All schools are public. Why? Because to have a private school system is to have a two-track system, and it's anti-democratic. It means that the private schools become the location, the object of those at the top who find ways to supplement their budget. You know that, or you ought to know it, because it's the perfect description of the city of New York and many other places in the United States, where people fight real hard to go to those schools where the parents have a PTA that raises extra money so they can do all the things that a school should do, but that most schools don't have the funds to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As interesting as all of these facts are, was the publication that I found where this was laid out. It's an American publication called The Business Insider. It's a newspaper for business men and women. It's not a radical publication. It's not even a general social sciences kind of. It's a publication for the business community. And it too was interested in why the Finns score so much higher than everybody else. And if you're interested, I have the citation here if you're interested, very recently in the business, so it's very up-to-date story. The next short item. Some of you have asked me, since I talk a lot about worker co-ops, to do more in the way of introducing you to the various kinds of worker co-ops there are in the United States, the differences among them, just because you can then become more comfortable with understanding that this is not some utopian fantasy about the future. This is something that people have been doing all around the world, including the United States, for quite a while. And that it might become important to stop leaving these institutions as invisible, as somehow not really there, or tiny, or marginal, or whatever else excuse there is not to give them the attention they deserve. So here's one. There are many to pick. I'm going to pick them from time to time and bring them to your attention. This is called Win Company, W-I-N Company. If you have not heard about it, here's the reason. It is a chain of supermarkets. It is based in Boise, Idaho, so unless that's a place you spend a lot of time at, you might not have encountered Win. But it has stores in Arizona, California, Idaho, Nevada, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, and Utah. Employees, 18,000. This is a sizable business, 18,000 people. It is a privately owned company where the majority of the shares are owned by those 18,000 employees. It is, in short, a worker-owned, that is, they have the majority. They're not the only owners, but if you take the workers together, they own a majority of the stock of this company. It was founded in 1967. This is a half-century-old business. It started in Idaho and is now, as I say, in all those states. It has become much larger. It operates a total of 118 stores. It's a sizable chain. It has grown very successfully. It's a business in which workers can own a growing number of shares, either by buying them or by having part of their salary be in the form of shares and the other part in the form of cash in the normal way. I wanted to stress that this is a company that is owned by the workers. That does not mean that it is run by the workers. In other words, a worker-owned enterprise is a kind of co-op. It's cooperatively owned by its own employees. It's therefore very much like an ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan. Some of you know that those exist all over the United States. But it's an open question whether the workers who are the majority owners decide as owners to have it run by the workers. That's an open question. They may, but they may not. It turns out in the United States that the majority of worker-owned businesses, and there are thousands and thousands of them, that the majority of them do not go the next step. They do not use their ownership in order to convert it into a worker-run enterprise. They either feel they are not competent to do that, or they feel that this is a professional specialty that should be given to people who have experience and professional qualifications to be businessmen, people with a Master of Business Administration or another such a thing. But they don't seem to have the confidence that they could run it themselves. Now, some do. Some use their position as owners to go the next step and to say, we want to be our own masters. We want to be our own employer. We don't want other people employing us. We want to be the employer, the director, the operator of the business, not just the owner. And America is the cooperative movement in America, which includes many more worker-owner cooperatives than it does worker-run cooperatives, is currently engaged in a debate and a struggle about these two kinds of co-ops. Which should you pursue, and how far should you pursue it if you take the kind of role? There are debates in the Win Company I just described to you exactly about whether they should go further, and more stores are, in fact, businesses are doing that. But I wanted you to be aware that this is an ongoing reality, and that unless you check very carefully, you may not even know when you go into a store or a factory or an office that it is either worker-owned or worker-owned and worker-run, if you follow the logic of what I've said to you. Okay. The next small item. This is so gross about the United States that, you'll pardon me, that it catches my attention. It's not that I'm looking for places where the United States doesn't look so good. It's just that there's so many of them. All right, this one is paid parental leave. That's when a government, society, passes a law, it's very important, passes a law that says every employer must give paid leave to people who are parents, who have a child together. So there's a lot of questions here. Do you give any? Then how much leave? 2 weeks? 6 weeks? 10 weeks? Half a year. Do you give it to one parent, typically the female, or do you give it to both parents? Is their job secure when they come back? A lot of questions. It's a complicated law. So the OECD, one of the most important sources of statistical information about the world economy that there are, there's a dozen of these, and this is one of the most important, the OECD, recently released a list of the 41 nations it follows. Most of them are in Europe, but not all, and compared whether they do or do not, and if they do, how many weeks of paid leave for parents are the law in the country. Okay, 41 countries. And you may be surprised. Here's the top of the list of countries that provide paid leave. Number 1, Estonia. Estonia provides 87 weeks of paid leave. That's almost 2 years. You have a child, have it in Estonia. Because you will get paid for almost 2 years to help raise the child. Try to keep in your mind, the relationship of the concept family values and parental leave, which is a way of kind of expressing your family value. You want to help new parents cope with this big change. Number 2 country in the world, Bulgaria. They give 77, so 10 weeks less than Estonia. 3rd country, Hungary. Hungary. Unbelievable. Now, why would the top 3 out of 41 be 3 countries that up until recently were, get ready, communist countries? Might there be some relationship, you think? Might there be there's a vague connection? Might it have been in these countries that they had certain kinds of benefits before, which even though they don't have that kind of government, the new government cannot risk taking away? Because it would cause such an uproar? Maybe. 4th country, Japan. 5th country, Lithuania. There we are again. 6th country, Austria. 7th country, Czech Republic. Next country, Latvia. Next country, Norway. Okay, I'm not going to read them all to you. It takes too much time. I want to jump down to number 41. The only country that has, ready? No paid parental leave in its laws. You're here. The United States of America. The new tax bill, if any of you interested, you come up here and see the statistics. There's a nice table, has all these green lines for how much parental leave you get, and at the bottom, circled in red, the United States has no green line because it provides 0. We're talking about the law. This doesn't mean that there aren't companies that give parental leave. They are. But it's up to the company. It can give it, it can take it away, and some do, many don't. But in these countries, it's not left to the preferences or whims of an employer. It's a law. Okay. The Trump tax bill going through right now, which has provisions that affect everything, in case you were wondering, there is absolutely nothing, either in the Senate version or in the House of Representatives versions, which are being put together right now, that does anything about this. So not only are we the only country in 41 that provides nothing, but there's nobody in the United States Congress, at least in the people that are in charge, that thinks this is worth doing anything about whatsoever. If I had more time, we would stop and I'd play the national anthem. But we don't, so I won't. Okay. My attention was also caught. I don't read this magazine very often, but it's the regular industry publication of the Recreational Vehicle Industry Association. Reading their publications is exactly as exciting as you probably already figured out it would be. It is unspeakably boring, and they have chosen writers who flunked out early in freshman English. Extraordinary, it's really extraordinary. But here's what caught my eye. Thor Industries, T-H-O-R, Thor Industries is the maker of something called the Airstream trailer. Some of you have noticed that brand name, Airstream, on the things you pull behind your car. I mean, you don't, the car does. And they had their best quarter, just completed ever, selling $2.2 billion worth of RVs, recreational vehicles. This caught my idea. That's my interest. What is that about? So I read on. Demand is so high, they can't make enough RVs to sell. That's not true of hardly any industry in America right now. The big problem in America is called excess capacity, when your ability to make is greater than what you can profitably sell. So what's happening to them? To make a long story short, I found out, here's what it is. We have two groups of people who are buying these things like there's no tomorrow. The first one is old people, retirees, who have figured out that they can't live the way they have been now that they are retired. And one of the things that's a big burden on them is the housing. And so now they get an RV, and it's much smaller, and you can park it down by the lake for a relatively small amount of money. And they're doing that. Lots of them are doing that. And you know who other big group is? The 25 to 34-year-olds. Because it turns out with the modern gig economy, otherwise known as the sharing economy, things which make it sound much better than what it is, they have no security. How in the world are they going to make a commitment to buy a house with all the payments over those years? They can't do that. They have to be ready to move because their jobs are insecure. They don't know from 1 month to the next, let alone from 1 year to the next. They can't make housing commitments, even if they could afford them, because it's too insecure. And they are buying the movable house so they can go where the jobs are. When you hear the word recovery and you see a statistic, look at the increasing production, among other things, of this, you're not observing a recovery. You're observing a downward ratcheting down of the standard of living, all hidden by the way these numbers are interpreted. Last one of these short things. And some of you know about this, perhaps others of you don't, but so I'll fill it in as best I can. Back in 2006, a man by the name of Mohammed I want to pronounce it right, Yunus, Y-U-N-U-S, received the Nobel Peace Prize. And I want to tell you why and what it means. He came up with a theory. He was an active economic kind of advisor, interested in helping poor people in poor countries do better. And he came up with the following theory. What's holding back poor people in poor countries is they don't have capital. They're poor. They don't have money. If only they had some money, they would start and build a business. In other words, the way you get an economy going is you liberate, I have to try to stay with my straight face here. I don't want to prejudge this situation or prejudice you in any way. But you have to liberate entrepreneurship. If that sounds like silly crap, good, it should. But the idea is simple, that among any group of 6 people, 4 of them are born business leaders, you know, like Donald Trump. And all they lack, which fortunately he didn't, was someone to give him a lot of money, which in his case was his father, who gave him a lot of money. He's a self-made man, as long as you understand that self-made means inherited. But poor people, of course, are poor because they didn't inherit, but they're full of entrepreneurship. You just gotta liberate it. And the way you do that is you give them money. But in poor countries, poor people can't get any money, Mr. Yunus argued, because no one will give them any money. Why? Because they're poor. So they're poor because they can't get any money, and they can't get any money because they're poor. That means, to use a technical term, you're screwed. But Mr. Yunus had a way out. It was called microcredit. And what it was the idea, we have been thinking in numbers that are too large. A poor woman in Bangladesh, or in Panama, or in Guinea, she, who is a born trader in the local market, we know that, we can see her doing it, boy, could she take off if she could just get $300, $410. She could buy coconuts and resell them at a higher price, or whatever it is she does. So Mr. Yunus got several governments in the third world, particularly in Asia, South Asia, to begin to do this. And it worked, or at least it seemed to. There were these people that borrowed the money. They couldn't get money anywhere else, and they were eager to buy, and they used it to set up small businesses. The early years looked really good. He got the Nobel Prize. He claimed that this process would overcome poverty in the third world in 1 generation. That's a heady claim, since poverty in these countries is thousands of years old and has resisted God knows how many efforts to overcome it. So he got a Nobel Prize. And he also quickly got the attention of very large commercial banks, because they said, ooh, here's an entire new market, people to whom we can make loans at interest we didn't think of before. We weren't willing to take a chance. The government took the chance for them. The government took the risk, collecting tax money and offering it to people in little mini loans, and it seemed to be going. Once the government had taken the risk, once the government had used its own resources to demonstrate that you could make money, in come the entrepreneurs at the bank, taking no risk at all, which is their specialty. Risk is only something they discuss when they give public speeches to the likes of us and explain that they took the risks we don't take. Of course, the minute you look at this nonsense, you discover that they didn't take any risk at all. So the big banks got in, and they lent. Why am I telling you all this? Because of a complete disaster. It has laid waste to hundreds of thousands of villages and people and families and communities. Why? Because it's based on an economic analysis that is fundamentally silly. Here's how it goes. Every economy has demand and supply. You need people to buy the stuff, and you need people to make the stuff, and the economy works by having some people make it and other people buy it, and you know, all that. But the logic of that means you need both. You need people who will supply the stuff, but you also need people who will buy the stuff. If all you do is stimulate the people who supply, here's your big risk. There won't be people to buy it. By lending huge amounts of little loans to millions of poor people, you did increase the supply. But these were poor people. You didn't increase the demand. And so you died. These little businesses died because they were very good at producing more. They invested and they worked real hard and they got more stuff and they put it out for sale. But nobody had thought about the other part, the demand. So it has now collapsed. Well, why would there be such a thing as an approach that says to focus on supply? It has a name in economics. It's called supply-side economics, for those who've never heard the term. It became famous under Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, two giants of the modern historical period. That was an attempt at humor, what I just did. What is supply-side economics? It's this argument that you can liberate the economy if you make it easier, more profitable for the supplier, the business, to pump out more stuff. And why am I telling you this story now? Because this is a lovely theory. You know why it's lovely? Because it allows the government to help businesses without having to say, we're helping businesses. As to the rest of you, sorry, have a nice day. We're helping businesses. This doesn't look good, taste good, or smell good. So you never say that. You say, you're liberating entrepreneurship. What is the rationale for cutting the taxes of corporations in America? That's what's about to be done. Tomorrow or the next day, they are about to cut it from 35%, that's the rate of taxation that corporations pay on their profits. And they're probably going to lower it to somewhere between 20 and 22%. They're still dickering somewhere in there. That's nearly a 50% drop in the tax on corporations. Ask yourself when you last had a 50% cut in your tax bill. Staggering. And what's the rationale? It's going to liberate production and jobs. And it's the same thing. It's Mr. Eunice again. You're helping the supply side. Why won't businesses, in fact, do this? Why does almost every economist, left, right, and center, say to the Republicans, this is not going to happen, what you're promising? Because it's not relevant to them. They're providing a tremendous Christmas present to the richest people in this society. And they're determined to do it. And the rationale they've always used is it will eventually be good for everybody. You know another name for that? Trickle-down economics. You help the people at the top and it trickles down. What trickles down is the wealth you help them have, not a case of urinary incontinence. Okay? Oh, good. That humor went better. So here we have Mr. Eunice messes up vast parts of the poor world with his lopsided supply-side economics. A lot of banks did well. They found new borrowers. They cashed in. It's good for them while it lasted. And they're on to other things. But for the mass of people, there was no solution at all. Good for the banks, not for anybody else. Always supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, liberating the entrepreneur. These are rationales for shifting the distribution of wealth and income from the middle and the bottom to the folks at the top. And the folks at the top have been doing that for the last 35 years, very successfully. And when you allow a tiny proportion of your people, 3, 5, 8%, to gather into their hands the bulk of the wealth of the society, I assume you all know the top 10% of the people own roughly 80% of the wealth in this country. It's absurd. We're going backwards to ancient Egypt and the pharaohs in the level of inequality. Well, when you do that, you of course create the incentive on the part of the rich. They're not stupid. They know that they're very rich. They've been working hard at it. They're getting it. Their biggest fear is what we call universal suffrage. If a tiny group of people have a lot of wealth and the rest of us don't, we will one day, even in America it'll happen, we'll realize there's a lot of us and there are not very many of them. Which means if you have universal suffrage, we outvote them. So let's use the vote to reverse what they did to us in the economy. Ha 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 ha. Solution for the rich people who have figured this all out too. You can't let the political system have universal suffrage. You have to buy the political system. You have to make the people who run it, the people who are elected in it, the people who work as lobbyists, depend on you for their money. Otherwise, they'll do what the system would have them do. You can't possibly have a democracy with this level of inequality. The two don't go together. Never have. And we're just living through that process. And it's everywhere. And it doesn't just screw us here, but it took care of unknown numbers, particularly of women in poor country who were the target for this microcredit business. Now discredited even by the World Bank, which was a big booster of it for a while. The lessons of supply-side economics. Okay, let's turn then to the urgent topics for now. I'm going to leave the tax to the crescendo end and start with a few other topics that were big in the last month. First, the decision by the United States, alone in the world, to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. For those of you who don't follow this has been a very difficult topic in the Middle East because Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have an important meaning that they attach in their respective religions to Jerusalem and what they believe happened there and so forth and so on. So it is an enormous, lightning rod of disagreement and difference and all the rest. And for a long time now, it has been left the way it is, that the capital of Israel is in a place called Tel Aviv, a city in Israel, and not in Jerusalem, and in a kind of deference to this situation. So for Mr. Trump, out of nowhere, for no discernible reason having to do with foreign affairs or international, anything, when there was a good chance, which he must have known, that people wouldn't like it, for those of you who don't follow this, there's been a virtual firestorm around the world against it. Almost nobody is in favor of it. The European Union, for those of you who might like to know, has decided not to do it. They will not recognize Jews. They took a harder position against it than they even had before. And Mr. Netanyahu, the leader in Israel, is completely isolated. He and Mr. Trump are two people on a boat in the middle of the water that's got many, many crabs eating it. Okay? I couldn't think of a better metaphor quicker, so we'll have to do with that one. Why did he do this? What in the world would put... There's nothing... I tried really hard. Is there any economic sense that this makes? No. Doesn't change or improve the American situation economically anywhere. Does it hurt the American? Absolutely. It makes all kinds of governments hostile, likely to take it out on the United States in a variety of ways, one of which has to do with how they're going to retaliate to this tax bill, which I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes. So here's the only answer I could come up with, and I'm doing this because many of you asked me to. The only sense I could make, the only logic that I could find why he did that had to do with the election in Alabama. That's what it was all about. Why? They knew from the polls that if they were going to win the election for Ray Moore, they needed to have the Christian fundamentalist community come out in massive numbers to vote that way, since the majority of their people seemed to be tilting in that direction. So they had to get out that vote. And by revving up their Christian fundamentalism, they might get that result. A little bit like having Steve Bannon crisscross Alabama to remind those who were white that they were in fact white. and to get them to identify with Mr. Moore as the whiter of the two. It's therefore a textbook example. If you take a course in foreign policy, in the United States foreign policy, here's one of the few principles that they can find. It's very hard. If you study American foreign policy and you want to find principles, it's a difficult task you're setting yourself, because it's really an adjustment all the time to whatever the situation is. The foreign affairs are, there's an old theory of this, foreign affairs are what you do for some domestic reason. You shouldn't, because the rest of the world actually matters, but you don't have the time to care. You're not going to be president or prime minister that long. For you, it's everything is tomorrow, next week, the next election. So you can't deal with foreign policy in a capitalist society in anything other than a very short-term, immediate perspective, and that is a question of your survival. Mr. Trump's tax bill, which is what we're going to talk about, is going to be determined by very few votes. They couldn't lose Roy Moore. And they tapped into the white supremacy, and they tapped into the Christian fundamentalism, and the way to do that was to show that Mr. Trump, who by that time had come out for Roy Moore and was campaigning for him, was taking a great Christian step to recognize Jerusalem, the place to which, for those of you who know this story, Jesus will return on his way back up and will take all of us with him, except those of us who don't have a ticket. And those of us without a ticket, if you read the Bible, will burn. So it's important for all of you to get a ticket. Next issue. Why is there a revolt going on against sex abuse, particularly suffered by women, but to some also men? I assume you have been all reading about this. Since it's all about sex, I'm being kind. I know you're glued to the details of all of this. As your favorite actress, actor reveals all, or most of all, or promises to reveal all. I was very struck, some of you may have seen the short public appearance of the actress Uma Thurman when she was asked about Harvey Weinstein, and looking daggers into the camera. She's a good actress, but she really knew how to say, "I don't speak until I'm ready. I don't want to say something I might regret. But when I'm ready, I will talk about Harvey Weinstein." If I were Harvey Weinstein, I would have fainted because the look in her eye. For those of you who don't know, she lives a few blocks from here. She has children, and she has a stroller, and she takes them all out for walks around here. But she is, if she's a typical, and my guess is she is, that's wow. So what's going on? Why would women who are telling us particularly that they have suffered this sort of behavior forever? So why now? I mean, why didn't you say this last week, last month, last year, 10 years ago, 50 years ago? Because actually when you ask the women, when the reporters do, out come the stories of way back. It's a long-lasting horror show. So that's a question. And part of the answer is in economics, which is why I want to talk to you briefly about it. The first one is, the first part of this story, is to remember how every business, every capitalist business, is organized in our society, because that's part of the key to the explanation. How is it organized? It's organized hierarchically. At the top of a business is the major shareholders and the board of directors. I've gone over that with you in the past. The way the board of directors is selected, the way any of you can get on the board of directors of any company, is simply to have the major shareholders vote for you. That's it. Do you have to have a college degree? Absolutely not. Do you have to have 2 legs? Not required. Do you have to have half a brain? That's probably the max they can handle. I'm kidding. There is no qualification. You just have to get the shareholders to vote for you. You get as many votes as you have shares. If you own 1 million shares, you get 1 million votes. If you have 11 shares, you get 11 votes. And if you have no shares, you get no votes at all. That's how it works. They make all the decisions. In most corporations, the board of directors, 15 people. Major shareholder, another 15, if that. That's it. They make all the decisions. What does that mean? It means they hire everybody else. And they fire them. In other words, they have the power to take or give away, give or take, your job, your livelihood, your ability to take care of yourself and your family, literally to live. They can also change the conditions of your work. They can move you from that nice airy room with a view of the park to that broom closet. They can do that. Some of you have had that enjoyable experience. They can make you work harder, faster, because they always have, even what they don't have to say, the threat of destroying the conditions under which you work or taking the job and the income away from you, and then telling any future employer that you're awful and shouldn't be given a job. All free to do all of that. Okay, if you allow your system of production to be organized in that way, how can you be surprised when the people at the top see an opportunity they don't face that often in life? I can get you to do anything, given what I can take from you if you don't. It turns out, this is going to come as a shock to many of you, it turns out that when it comes to sexual affairs, an awful lot of people have a challenge when it comes to what we might call maturity. They reach 14, 15, 16, and then it doesn't progress. And those are the kind of people who, discovering that they are the boss in some workplace, see an opportunity to work off their difficulties, I'm being as polite as I know how, by compelling, under threat of firing or not getting a promotion or getting the conditions changed or not getting a chance to show what you can do and so forth, unless you provide sexual services. This cannot be surprising if you think about the logic of this. But it's worse, right? We don't just organize our businesses hierarchically, but not surprisingly, if you organize something as important as the production of goods and services we can't live without in a hierarchical way, you're going to get other social institutions likewise organized in a hierarchical way. For example, your churches can have a hierarchy of people who have unbelievable power because they may, in fact, shape your soul, your access to the nice place, your ability to avoid the warm, unpleasant place, right? And they might use their authority, their power, to do unspeakable things, say, to children. If I would have to explain to you what I'm referring to, then you haven't paid attention for the last 10 years. And then I can't help you. You need much more help than I can provide. Okay? So you get it. But here's another one. And this is the answer to the question. The household. Women have been struggling against what they call patriarchy. Well, what is that? That's an authoritarian, hierarchical structure. The man is the king in the castle of his home. What an image. A king. You know what kings did to their subjects? It's not a good image. You don't want to be the king. Kings don't end up in a happy way most of the time. They lose their heads, people shoot at them, and they get deposed. You know, you really want to be the king. Well, if you organize your household in an authoritarian, structured way, if the man is the boss, the man wears the pants and all the rest of that literature and those images, then you're going to have the same dangerous consequences. In America, for example, for most of the history of this country, women couldn't own land. They couldn't own the home. When they got married, they moved into the house owned by the husband. who, as owner of private property, could push them out. Then they'd be left with nothing. They had no rights to accumulate property. You may not know it, but they could not say no to a sexual demand. Spousal rape did not become a crime in the United States until 2006. That's frighteningly recent. Before 2006, if your spouse imposed himself or herself on you, and there's nothing I can say. There's nothing, there was no consequence to that. I mean, something might go wrong with the relationship, one would hope, but you were not in legal difficulty. You didn't commit a crime, you didn't violate the rules of the society. Starting in the 1970s, the American household changed radically. Especially for white people, it was a little different for African Americans, but for white people, women, for all kinds of complicated reasons, had to leave the household. They could no longer be sustained by the husband and the income that the husband earned, which until that time had generally been enough not only to reproduce the man, but to pay for a wife and children in a household. A wife who stayed home and minded the children and maintained the household and took care of the elderly and all of the functions housewife might represent. Well, because of technology, the computer, and outsourcing, the movement of good jobs out of the country, it was no longer necessary to pay men the kinds of salaries you had before. You were able to give the jobs to lower paid workers outside, China and India and Brazil, or you would replace them with machines. And so the wages of men went nowhere, stopped rising. They've been rising for 150 years, stopped rising. Meanwhile, the American family had promised the American dream to itself. Husband to the wife, parents to the children, and so on. You're going to have a good education, you're going to have this, you're going to have that, we're going to have a car and 2 dogs and a station wagon and a fir tree in the backyard or whatever else and you're going to go to college. This is not possible. Not with a man whose wages are going nowhere, while the cost of all these things I just mentioned keeps going up. Solution, wife has to go out and work. She has to add paid work outside the home to whatever she's doing inside the home. And I mean add, because every statistical study of who does the work in the household indicates that the women, after they went out to work, still did 80% of the work in the house. There was no rearrangement here because of the hierarchy. The man didn't want to sweep the floor, to do the dishes, or do all the rest. And so he didn't, which he could get away with, sort of, for a while. But then it exploded. Why? The women were physically exhausted. They were mentally exhausted. They basically added a second job outside the house with all of its different pressures and problems to the one they still had inside the house. Plus they were facing a man who was getting more and more upset because his job was going nowhere. He wasn't the man of the house who took care of his wife. He needed a wife who went out there and worked too, and he had to rearrange it, and he might make now demands, sexual and otherwise, to recoup his manliness because it had been undercut by the economics. But since no one explained to him that the economics was his problem, he thought she was. Wow. So American women began to react in a variety of ways. Number one, they divorced their husbands at a staggering rate. You know the United States has the highest rate of divorce in the world, and has for 30 years. Women do the bulk of the divorcing. They've had enough of all of this. They can't stand it. And the proof is a large number of them never get married again. Made that mistake once, and I'm not doing that again. Women are the largest consumers of psychotropic drugs in the world, American women. Nobody takes as many tranquilizers, antidepressants, as American women, particularly white women. Sort of remarkable if you think about it. Too much pressure, too much tension. They can't stand it. And if there's a whole generation that has gotten out from under in the hierarchical structure of the household, only to go into the workplace and get it all again, it's too much. And you can't divorce your boss, because it's not what you do with the boss. So what do? You begin to look for ways to push back. And that's what we're in the middle of. A long delayed and therefore accumulated rage for all the times that you had to absorb this crap. Just like a divorce isn't about whatever happened last week or last month, it's about the whole lifetime that led to that moment when you couldn't anymore and you were gonna, because it's very painful for everybody to do that. You have to be really needy to engage what you know is going to be painful for you, for the partner, for children if they're there, and all the rest of it. So I think the economics of all of this is an enormous, and therefore for me, as a critic, very positive recognition that this hierarchical capitalist system is a disaster. And not just in the ways we've been talking about, but even in these ways that we might not at first have seen as economically shaped. And that brings me to what the solution is, which shouldn't come as a surprise to you that I'm about to say this. Co-ops. The way that the solution is no, seriously. Why? Because in the co-op, the employer and the employee are the same people. There's no minority of people in a position to take your job from you unless you do something to flatter their immature fantasies, which are not, by the way, only sexual, right? All kinds of crazy things. You all have stories if you've worked in a business where someone above you in the hierarchy, makes you behave in this way or that way, do this task or that task, which has no rational connection to what this business is about, but is pandering to the insecure ego of that individual. Look, we all have egos with problems. The question is, do we have a system in which we can impose those problems on the people we work with? That ought not to be possible. For sure, you ought not to allow the presence or absence of a job, the presence or absence of an income, to be decided by one person sitting above you in some kind of hierarchy. That ought to be a collective decision, since it is enormously consequential for everybody in the group. That ought to be decided collectively in some way where you can have an appeal. There oughtn't to be people in the position of giving and taking jobs and other people in the passive position of having to accept what those other people do. What kind of relationships does this produce? Well, we're seeing what it produces. So if you want to really do something, change the conditions. Otherwise, what we're left with is really lame. What we're left with, and you can see it already in the press, all kinds of people, well-intentioned, I'm not imputing anything to their intentions, but they're kind of giving us the equivalent of just say no. Particularly to men, don't do that. That's ugly, that's crude, that will have the same success with sexual oppression and sexual abuse as what we used to do when Mrs. Reagan suggested we tell the people who with drug problems, just say no to drugs. You all know we have a much worse drug problem now than we did then. Her proposal didn't work out real well. And to tell men, or women for that matter, in powerful positions, don't abuse your position, is lame. Don't give them the position in which they can do their abuse. Would be a better way to go. You got to change, this is the hard part, you got to change the economic system because it's part of the problem here. Otherwise, you are going to have lots of talk, lots of heart-to-heart conversations, a lot of confrontations, a lot of ruined careers, a lot of explosive emotional moments, difficult for all those involved, which you could justify if you're changing the problem. But this seems to me to be an evasion of the solution, what we're doing now, because it's a fear to look at the economic dimensions and the economic changes that might do something about it. Okay, in the time we have remaining, the big one, the tax bill. First of all, and I want to thank the person, I won't mention who it is, who provided me with a prop, which I'm about to show you. Ready? This is the tax code of the United States. It comes in 2 volumes. This is part 1, and this is part 2. Dated summer 2016, the last time we had a revision. So, okay, you with me? This is what the ladies and gentlemen of the United States Congress are adjusting. Okay? How many pounds? Each one of these is maybe 8 or 9 pounds. So this together, almost 20 pounds of hair. And poundage is probably as good a way to get at it as any other. Why do I show you the prop? Because, to be brutally honest with you, having provided testimony both at, well, no, I've never done it at the federal level. I've only provided testimony at state legislatures. If you provide testimony at a state legislature, one thing that happens to you is you come into personal interaction with state legislators. And for this, you need much help. Because whatever disappointments in life you have endured before stand as nothing when you confront people who have extraordinary power to make and change laws that you have to live with, who gave as much attention to the law they just signed off on as you gave to the advertisements at the back of a free magazine that was thrown on your lawn last week. They don't know, and they don't care. They got to the legislature because they have a small travel agency in Dipsy-Doodleville, which is in that area. And they're not doing real well, and they need more customers. So they joined the local church and became an avid member of the Bible study class in the hopes that the people they met there would be taking trips for which they would need a travel agent. And then they got the better idea, run for office. A lot more people get your name than if you just take a Bible class. So they run for office, and now they are state representative something. And people pay attention to them, and they become well known. And they enjoy that, and their business prospers. And they become a state senator because the business prospers more. And they're very active. But time to spend going through this, they don't want to. This is very, look at the print here. This is lots and lots of pages of really little print. And this is as interesting as last week's wet noodles. This is unspeakably boring. Plus, you need to know technical stuff to make heads or tails of it, and they don't have any of that. That's not required to be on the tax writing committee, either at the local or the state or the federal level. Do you know that the new tax law, which is just as complex as this one, has been available in its entirety to the people in the Congress for 2 weeks, during which time they had many other things to do. And they didn't have the time. Many of them complained about it. Not just Democrats, Republicans also complained. You're giving us this. The truth of the matter is, it's usually given to them kind of late. And even if it were given them 2 weeks earlier, you think it makes much of a difference? Stop. This is a technical document. Who writes it? Technically, people employed by the committees of the Congress that are in charge of this, people like me, PhDs in economics, accountants, lawyers, stuff like that, get together and they write it. They get instructions from the political people. They write it. While they are writing it, they are besieged by people with a very good idea of what needs to be done. And often the supervisor, the actually elected official, tells them, to his technical people, you talk to this one with good advice, not that one. And you talk to that one. What is that about? Those are people are called lobbyists. They are there, they are paid very well by industries, you know, the banking industry, the retail sales industry, the mining industry, the RV industry, and their job is to get particular things written in there somewhere on page 4027 are 3 lines which will give them a particular way to make more money. It's worth it to pay a lobbying firm $3 million a year to get those 3 lines in this book. Why? Because those 3 lines will make millions for the RV or any other industry, and compared to that, $3 million to the lobbyist is one of the best investments you could ever have made. It gets written by the lobbyists because they're the ones on top of the detail, because they're the best paid, much better paid than the technical writers. They're the ones. And so the technical writers, to save time and energy and pressure, get a press release from one of these lobbyists, and they just copy it into the law. I've seen it. I mean, copy. I mean, photocopy and stick it in there. So what does this law do? Very quickly. The fundamental purpose and function of this law is to redistribute income and wealth from the middle and the bottom of this country to the top. If you don't understand that, you're not paying attention. Even my Republican colleagues, economics professors that I know, understand that. There is no question that's what this does. And let me go through the big ones. You're cutting the profits tax from 35% to somewhere between 20 and 22. A spectacular, huge cut in the tax that corporations have to pay. You've never had anything like that. You, the average American, never had anything like a cut of nearly 50% suddenly. The rationale, by the way, just so you see the utter disconnect between the reality and the rationale. The rationale is 35% is higher than what what's called the titular rate or the formal rate in other countries. That's correct. It's higher at 35% than, say, in many European countries. But that's an irrelevant fact. Why? Because in the United States, unlike those countries, there are a whole set of things called deductions and exemptions, things that are legally usable by a company to reduce its profits in terms of what is taxed below what the profits are to a taxable profit number. When you adjust it, you get something called the effective tax rate. It's what it's called in the textbooks that people like me study and teach. The effective tax rate is how much taxes they pay as a percentage of their profits before they take away the exemptions and the deductions. Guess what? In the United States, the rate is roughly 26, 27%. It's not 35, it's way lower. And guess what? The average in Europe, 26 and 27 is the same. There is no competitive disadvantage that American corporations face. So this is just a gift. You're taking it from the 35, which some companies have to pay because they don't get. And where are the deductions and exemptions? That's what you pay the lobbyist to put in here. That's what makes all the big difference. That's why you have to have your lobbyist there. Otherwise, those 3 lines don't get in there. That's why they're there. And if you don't have a lobbyist, you're screwed, which is how you are here. The next thing, just as important. They are going to give an incentive for companies that have earned profits over the last 20 years, but kept them in an account outside the United States. I have to explain this. Take off my jacket before I can't. Thank you. I almost did that, and that would mess up the sound system. My apologies. Here's the problem. One of the nice lines written in here, not that many years ago, by the way, I think in the 1980s or 90s, A law was written by these companies which said, if you earn profits abroad, which in these days American companies do a lot of, and you keep the profits in an account overseas, you don't have to pay any profits tax at all. You only have to pay the profits tax if and when you bring the profits back into the United States, called repatriating your profits. So companies that either do a lot of business abroad or can fake the documentation to make it look like they earn it abroad, and there's equal numbers of both, they don't pay any taxes until they bring it home. And so the Trump administration is saying, in order to get you to bring it home, we're going to give you a special deal. If you bring it home, say in 2018, you will only have to pay, and they're not negotiated that, 5% or maybe 10%. Now let's make sure we all understand. This is a reward for not paying taxes for 25 years because you didn't pay, because remember, for 25 years, we're talking trillions. Who are the biggest holders of money abroad? Some of you have seen these stories. Google, Amazon, what? Apple, all of them. The ones with the social consciousness, who are concerned about the country and its future, are robbing you blind. They don't pay anything. They keep it abroad. By the way, does that mean they don't have the use of the money? Of course not. They put that money into an account in a bank in London. There's two ways they can get at that money to make use of it. A, as the owner of that deposit, they can tell the bank in London, this is what I want you to do with it. I want you to buy so many shares of General Motors. I want you to buy so many shares. No problem. None. And if they would like to spend it literally in the United States, here's the easiest way you do it. You go downtown New York into the office of Citibank, and you say to Citibank, I'd like a loan of $50 billion. They take you into a very nice room the minute you talk like that. And you get the loan. You know why? Because you put up collateral. What's the collateral? The money in the London bank is the collateral. So you have use of your money anyway. If you have a good investment, you will have already done it. Bringing that money back to the United States changes nothing. It's just a reward to them that allows them not only to have gotten away with paying the taxes all those years, but to now get rewarded by a special low rate because it sounds good to the American people. We're bringing the money home, and if we bring the money home, it'll be invested here. Folks, if there was a good investment here, they would have been able to do that long ago. They would have borrowed and invested. They're not going to do that. Back in 2004, we did this before. We've been through this. 2004, we also gave a tax holiday to people companies who brought their profits back. Big promises that would create jobs. None were created. You know what they did with the money when they brought it home? Paid out more dividends to their shareholders, upped the salaries of their CEOs, which they are free to do. If you cut the taxes of a corporation, is that going to produce jobs? The answer is, there's no way for you to know. Because in a free private enterprise system, when you cut the taxes of corporations, they are free to do with the money they don't have to pay taxes on anymore, whatever the hell they want. Are they free to pay it out to shareholders as dividends? Yes! Are they free to pay higher salaries to their chief executives? Yes! Is it likely they'll do that? That's what they've been doing for 30 years. Of course it's likely. Why in the world should they use that money to produce goods and services? Because that's the Muhammad Yunus problem. They're not going to invest it because the American people can't buy it. And nobody else can either. That's why they're not investing. And if they do think there's something they can sell to Americans, they're going to produce it in China because it's more profitable. So if any of that money creates jobs, it will not be for Americans. It'll be for foreign people who produce goods and services. So what this is all about is a redistribution of wealth rationalized by catch-as-you-can arguments that they hope people won't think through enough to realize they're being had. Here's the worst one. The Republicans, sad as they are, have been busy for the last 25 years undoing the New Deal, undoing the vast collection of social welfare that was enacted in the aftermath of the collapse of the 1930s. And the rationale they did for why they had to cut food stamps or cut welfare. Remember Clinton? The end of welfare as we know it, all this sort of bombastic stuff, which, by the way, the Democrats did as well as the Republicans. The rationale behind it, let's remember, was America has a deficit. We owe so much money. We can't afford a welfare system. We can't afford to do all these wonderful things. We just can't afford them. Because if we did them, we'd have to borrow the money, and that would increase the deficit of what we owe. We can't do that. That's why Republicans have been using that rationale for 30 years. That's why it's awkward now that the very tax bill they're proposing to cut the taxes on business, they can't, at least in the early years, they can't figure out how to do that without cutting massively social programs. By the way, to not borrow money to enable them to cut the taxes of corporations, that would mean cutting your Social Security. That would mean taking away your Medicare and Medicaid. Not all of it, but big chunks of it. Which, by the way, they're planning to do next year anyway. But they can't do it right away because you couldn't sell the American people on the following plan. We're going to cut the corporations' taxes a big time and we're sticking it to your grandma. It doesn't look good. It doesn't sound right. It will make people get unhappy. So they won't do it. Here's what they're going to do. They're going to keep spending roughly what they're spending this year, cut the taxes, and borrow the money instead. They're going to increase, by the Republicans' own calculation, they're going to increase the deficit $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. The party that said the deficit was the worst thing you could have, so bad that you had to cut school lunch programs, is now itself a champion of bigger deficit. This is awkward. It makes mental giants like Ryan really have a hard time explaining to his constituents in Wisconsin how he just changed gear in mid-flight. Incredible what this is. But here comes the best part. When the government cuts the taxes on corporations and the rich, and then has to borrow the money to maintain what the government's programs are because it's not getting that money from corporations and the rich, it has to borrow the money. Where do you think it goes to get the money it has to borrow? The same people. Well, the only people who have money to lend are the companies that are not paying taxes to the same government. They, instead of paying taxes, will now lend it to the government. Now I ask you, if I was a government official and I came to your house and I said, now I give you a choice. You can either pay your taxes, I take them from you, done, or I borrow the same amount of money from you, pay you interest for each of the next 10 years, and then give it all back to you. How hard a choice do you think that would be? That's what rich people are getting. A big, fat Christmas present. And you're paying for it. You, the audience around this country, and you here in the room, you're paying. You're paying in the form of a deficit, which Ryan is already saying next year will need to be the cuts in the entitlement programs for the mass of people because the deficit is so much bigger that they made to give these taxes. It boggles the mind. It truly does. In the little bit of time left, a couple of brief things, and then there's an announcement I need you to stay for. First, there is also an estate tax provision here. I really need to tell you about that. I've told you in the past, but it gets a laugh, and it's psychic relief, maybe. Under the law today, that is the law before it's changed, under the law today, the first $11 million that you and your spouse leave to your children is tax-free at the federal level. There is no estate tax on the first $11.5 million. So some of you are clearly smiling. Big relief you don't have that worry. I assume that those of you that are not smiling are those who have more than 11. But don't worry. The Republicans and Trump want to either raise the amount you can pass without a tax, or, which many of them want, to eliminate the tax whatsoever. Okay? Now let's talk about that briefly. The richest man in America today is Jeffrey Bezos. He's the head of Amazon, and his wealth last week went over $100 billion. Just to give you an idea, there are 54 countries in Africa, 54, count them. Only 4 of the countries in Africa produce more goods and services in a year than Mr. Bezos owns. He is a bigger player in the world economy than 50 out of the 54 countries in Africa. Okay? Mr. Bezos has more money than the 16 poorest states in the United States produce in a year of the work of their citizens. This is Pharaoh. This is absurd. With the new law, Mr. Bezos will be able to leave the entire $100 billion without a federal tax to his children. It represents the end of any vague effort of the United States to break from the old Europe that it thought it was doing at the time of the American Revolution. You're creating here, and you're cementing into place, a hereditary ruling class. The wealth of this country, as it's concentrated in a smaller and smaller group of people, is now becoming hereditary. Their children will have it, and their children's children will have it. And if the rich have it, you and your children won't. Again, if I had time, the American anthem, but I don't. The amazing thing, and this is scary, but there's no other way to end this. If this goes through, and there's every sign that it will, it'll be some adjustments, but it will within the next few days. The only promise really made to the American people that counts from this is that there are going to be real benefits to you next year, the year after. There'll be more jobs, there'll be higher wages. Most of the economics profession thinks nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. Now let's suppose the profession is right and the Republicans are wrong. On the one hand, they don't care because they're taking care of the rich people who put them in office and who pay them. And this is the return reward that those rich people get for their contributions. The Republicans are looking great with all the money. That's their political view. But if the mass of people are screwed, then the only real political question in America will be, how do you explain that? Whose fault is it? Where are you going to put your anger that you are not getting government supports at a time when you're not getting any improvement in your life? What's happening here? And then there'll be people like us, and I hope you're with me on this, who will explain it the way I've tried to explain it to you tonight, what's going on and why. But that's not the explanation that Mr. Trump can afford to give, and it's not the explanation that Republicans, because it would be self-destroying for them to say anything like this. They've got to come up with an alternative explanation for why they did what they did and it didn't have the good consequences for everybody else. Why the trickle down didn't happen. And they're going to have to blame somebody else, or else the blame is going to come on them. And people can get very angry if they've been screwed economically and someone explains to them, well, that's not all, friend. You've been screwed within your head as well, and you believed all that stuff, and you voted for those people, and you're now getting their thank you, which is a boot in the face. They're going to have to come up with another explanation for economic disaster. And they're going to revert, unless they're very unusual, to the way people in that situation have always reverted. They're going to find scapegoats. And you already know who they are. They are the immigrants. They are the African Americans. They are the people who aren't white. They are, you fill it in, the intellectuals, the urban people, the northerners. It doesn't really matter. It varies. It's that those people have done it to us because they've got to come up with something. And if the rest of us fight back, then this country dissolves. And you ought to worry about that, because that's not a pretty prospect. But it is the kind of relentless dead-end corner into which the society